Maybe, Prej, let's come to you and talk about specifically in South Africa on the JSE. What are you all doing to create opportunities, create new products that will attract long-term institutional investors?
Thanks, Sacha. And I'll echo Oscar's comments to say thank you to the Africa Investor team for having us here. So, there's a lot of numbers specifically talking around infrastructure and infrastructure spend. So let me throw in my number as well from a South Africa perspective, that we're looking at sort of 870 billion rands over the next 3 years for infrastructure development in South Africa, which is significant. And one of the products that the JSE is working on and has been working on for a year is the development of listed project bonds. So to contextualize it, that 870 billion rands worth of spend is significant, and there's definitely a match for institutional investors for these long-term assets. And in 2015, when the JSE sat down together with the World Bank and National Treasury and tried to understand how it is that we can crowd in pension fund money, the concept of listed project bonds was born, at least from a JSE perspective. If we look at the South African market, the assets of non-banks sit at almost double that of the bank. So the numbers that you'll hear is about 8 trillion rands worth of non-bank financial assets available for deployment versus the 4 that sit within the banks. And as capital costs potentially increase for banks and other traditional sources of funding for infrastructure development, certainly pension fund money becomes more attractive. So to the back end of 2015, the JSE established a work group together with various other stakeholders, including S&P and local banks, as well as international bank representatives, to develop a framework for listed project bonds in order to crowd in the pension fund money. We've quite far advanced in terms of developing those listings requirements, which will be available for public comment in the next few weeks, and then hopefully provide a platform for the listing of projects for investment via these listed project bonds. Another feature of the work that we're trying to do, and the previous panelist actually mentioned it, was around the creation of a separate asset class for infrastructure. This is certainly a case, where we've got regulation in South Africa, Regulation 28, and Oscar's also alluded to that, where you've got pension fund policy which allows for a certain investment into listed instruments. And given the importance and the size of the infrastructure spend, we certainly believe that the creation of a separate asset class will warrant, or will be warranted. So it's definitely a piece of work that we're also trying to get over the line. Also from an infrastructure perspective, the JSE's had a lot of success with a product called Special Purpose Acquisition Companies, or SPACs, which is essentially an equity instrument which enables capital raising on the JSE for the acquisition of operating assets within a period of 24 months. 6 SPACs have listed on the JSE, and of the 6 SPACs, 3 are involved in the renewable energy space. 1.1 billion rand has been raised for these SPACs in renewable energy, and 3 of those SPACs have already acquired assets. The one is Hulisani, which raised 500 million in April 2016 and managed to complete a transaction to acquire a shareholding in the Kucha wind farm. Gaia Infrastructure raised 550 million in November 2015, and they've acquired a stake in Dorper wind farm. And a smaller company, Renogen, which is one of the first SPACs that had listed, it listed on the Altex, which is the JSE's junior board, and raised just under 100 million rand, and it also has made an acquisition of a windfall energy plant as well. So certainly some development on the equities front as well. And just one last point to mention would be some of the work we're doing around green bonds. Also, as climate change becomes or is very topical, and given that there is certainly various forms of assessment or labeling of green bonds, we as the JSE have developed a framework to try and develop our own sort of labeling criteria for the listing of green bonds. which is, we already have green bonds listed on the JSE without a formal JSE sort of labeling criteria or mechanism for it in the form of IDC, IFC, and the City of Johannesburg. And there's certainly talk of other municipalities listing green bonds. So we're trying to do some work in that space as well to be relevant.
Great. Thanks, Prej. I'm sure we'll come back to the whole public equities discussion during the Q&A.
Doing business in Africa. You can't afford to be without Africa Investor.